the superintendent of the Houston Independent School District, which is the 7th largest school district in the country, also testified. And he talked about the need for human capital, that how important human capital is. And you mentioned teacher evaluations. You mentioned investing in a workplace that is favorable to teachers. And those were really the two really positive takeaways and the common ground that seemed to be throughout the hearing process is the need to have. So far, we've evaluated students, and it seems to me that the reason that we evaluate students, that we've focused on that, is because the adults aren't doing what they're supposed to be doing.
Yes, that's exactly right.
And now we've progressed to we really need to look at the adults in the system. That's really the key, is evaluating the adults. And that seems to have widespread support. What has a much narrower base and much, I guess, where the diversity and maybe some potential for conflict comes in is what that evaluation system looks like. And what level is that system designed? I'm a little surprised by that. What constitutes good leadership in one town is different than another town or another state. I don't understand that. Maybe you can enlighten me.
I wish I had a good answer for that. I can tell you that what we have found is that in successful schools, the leadership is the best part of that school. Mm-hmm. Now, can I quantify that for you? Sort of. I mean, you have to have, as a principal, you have to be a good instructional leader. You can't just be somebody who sits behind a desk and moves paper around and signs off on things. You have to be up and moving around and going into classrooms, working with the teachers on a one-to-one basis to make sure that they're delivering instruction. So as a principal, you've got to understand instructional stuff. If you're in a school that has weak leadership or leadership that doesn't have the kind of resources that it needs, chances are your school's going to struggle. But it's really hard to codify all that. It's really hard to put all that in a list and say, well, here's what makes a good leader. We actually do have what we call the standards and indicators for school improvement. And these are, I think there are 81 items that you can use as a checklist when you go into a school to say, does the school do this? Does it do that? And if it does those things, then 9 times out of 10, that school can be high performing if it's not. But what usually happens is schools aren't doing all of those things. A lot of those are related to leadership, to the administration of the school, the administration of the district, and because all of that's tied together. But then when you talk about evaluating these administrators and teachers too, how do you evaluate them? The big question now is, do you tie student results directly to a teacher's evaluation? Because after all, that's the product. That student learning is the product of the work of this teacher or this administrator. And so it makes sense to people logically to tie student results to a teacher's evaluation. And in most people's minds, what they think of is, well, okay, if you've got a whole class full of kids and they're all making D's, then that means that the teacher's bad and the teacher needs to go away. That's a very simplistic way to look at teacher evaluation, and that's not what we're looking at. We are looking at incorporating, eventually, student growth into a teacher's evaluation. So the 4th grade teacher can look a couple of years down the road at her students and say, okay, are they where they need to be? Once they leave my classroom, are they continuing to learn? Are they getting the base that they need to move on to the next grade? Those are the kinds of things that we would be looking at. But it's a very complex way of trying to imagine how you evaluate an employee based on what that employee produces. We think of evaluations not necessarily in the human sense, but in the product sense. If you work in a factory, you're evaluated on how many widgets you put together in an hour. Right. If you're a CPA, you may be evaluated on how many clients you help rearrange their finances in a month, and so on and so forth. but most of that is all paper stuff or physical stuff. It's not a human being. It's not a child who may be moving around a lot with his parents. It's not a child who doesn't have enough to eat. It's not a child who has some sort of physical disability, who is an English language learner, who, has other issues that have maybe prohibited them from learning at the level that they need to learn at.
It's not realistic to expect a first-year teacher to be as good as a 10-year teacher.
First, we have the Kentucky Teacher Internship Program, which takes teachers who are not in the classroom yet. They want to be teachers, and they go through this program before they actually are put in a classroom by themselves, and they work with veteran teachers, and they model the kinds of good things that they see under those teachers, and they are guided by those teachers, and they're evaluated, and they do things so that the veteran teachers can tell them that they need to improve on this or whatever. The other thing that we've just done this year was the Teaching, Empowering, Leading, and Learning Survey, the TEL Kentucky survey. We asked all of our public school teachers, all 44,000 of them, and all of our principals, all 1,200 or so of them, to participate in this online survey. And it was a fairly broad-ranging survey that looked at things like working conditions. How, do you feel comfortable in your school? Do you feel supported in your school? Are you getting the training that you need? Are you getting the resources that you need? And it even went down to the condition of the school building. Is everything working okay in your school building? So we got all of our teachers, for the most part. I think our participation rate was the highest of any of the states that have done this at something like 85%, 85, 90% of our teachers and principals responded. So we're able to look at that data, and districts are able to look at their own data and say, oh, well, in this school, they're really happy with how things are going, but maybe they've got some issues over in this school. So those are a couple of big things that are going on statewide that allow us to not only sort of look at what teachers are doing, but hear back from them and get feedback from them on what they need to do their jobs better.
A friend of mine said, I said, we have a problem exporting, mass-producing success. And he says, you can't do that. He says, it's all about leadership. It's all about having that X factor of good people. There's only so many of those around. And then we go forward to the hearings, and the superintendent of the Houston School District says that human capital is tremendously important. It's tremendously difficult, and it takes a ton of resources. And he says that sometimes you have to be willing to go through 3 principals or 5 principals in a single school, and that you have to, it's not just replace the principal and it's all going to be better. It's right. You have to go through sometimes a very lengthy process to find the right person and the right fit. Is there just a lack of political will in this state to do that? Because we're not doing it now. Is that a fair assessment? That
we're not doing it now, but we sort of have the infrastructure to kind of go that way.
But we're not.
House Bill 176, which was passed a year or so ago in the General Assembly, outlines how we deal with schools that are persistently low achieving, and it defines what it means to be a persistently low achieving school, and then what you have to do as a result. That's where we get our statutory authority to go in and analyze a school and say the principal doesn't have the capacity to do this, the school council doesn't have the capacity to do this. That's a sort of a new start for us. We've never been able to do that really in the past. You're right, it is a whole new ballgame. We had some legislative ability in the past to do that, but we didn't exercise it. Now, I can't tell you why, other than it is one of the most difficult things to do. It is extremely difficult to go in and say, this principle's not working out.